Hello, everyone. My name is Nicole Parker, pronoun she, her, hers, and I'm the project coordinator for TransAction Florida. Thank you so much for joining us today for TransChat, a virtual town hall series featuring amazing trans and non-binary community leaders. Today, I am very excited as we are going to talk about the non-binary experience. We have some great leaders joining us today to talk about it. First and foremost, we have Pren Osea. Pren Osea is a queer genderqueer person from Tampa, Florida. They are passionate about creating community and resources for underserved LGBTQIA+ folks, promoting sustainability and environmentalism, mental health awareness, and youth empowerment. Pren earned their bachelor's degree in women's and gender studies at the University of South Florida, where they spent their free time developing resources on campus for trans and non-binary students. They founded the Trans Plus Student Union in 2013, a student organization that is still thriving and creating community for trans and non-binary students. Recognized for their passion for advocacy, work on campus, they were hired by the Office of Multicultural Affairs as a student assistant for LGBTQ+ initiatives, so they could help create queer-specific programming and expand and facilitate USF's Safe Zone training program. Looking back on their time at USF, Pren would say that their greatest achievement was developing a proposal and programming for Stonewall Studies, USF's LGBTQ+ living learning community in the residence halls, which launched in fall of 2018. In 2016, Pren founded Outside the Binary peer support group, which has grown to 4 meetings a month now on Zoom. Pren plans to continue courageously following their passions and being a resource and change maker in their community, and plans to get their master's degree in climate change and sustainability. Help me in welcoming Pren.
Hi, thanks so much, Nicole.
Hello, how are you?
Doing great, how are you?
Good. Next, we have Christopher Cuevas. As the executive director of Q Latinx, Christopher Cuevas provides vision, energy, and leadership in the fulfillment of the mission and vision of the organization, working to advance the visibility of and empower the LGBTQ+ Latinx communities and create spaces that foster growth and healing. A lifelong peace practitioner, educator, and community organizer, Christopher leads their work for the cultural transformation by centering the unapologetic and unwavering power of radical love. A child of undocumented immigrants and a queer person of color, Christopher interconnects their lived experiences and drives the necessary heart work of building a culture of peace, compassion, and change through advocacy for LGBTQ+ immigrant and radical justice movements. Through their work with the state, national, and transnationally recognized initiatives and organizations, Christopher has led conversations and facilitated educational campaigns specifically addressing structural racism, health, equity, and LGBTQ+ issues. In acknowledgement of their commitment to the social equity of LGBTQ+ justice, Christopher was honored by the public broadcasting station as an American Graduate Champion under the direction of the United States Department of Health and Human Services Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Christopher led the efforts to address health disparities and introduce comprehensive measures for practical solutions that directly support communities living with HIV in the South. An avid peace builder, Christopher serves on the board of directors for the Peace and Justice Institute, a nationally recognized center for peace education. Help me in welcoming Christopher. Hey, love. I think you're muted.
Yes, hi.
How are you? Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no, thank you for inviting me.
Next, we have Graciela Kane. A bleeding heart, rainbow-fueled, passionate nightingale has taken a form that is Graciela. They have been a core organizer for Girls Rock Camp of Jacksonville for over 7 years. It is an organization that cultivates self-empowerment and positive identity development in girls and trans youth. They believe in personal freedom, sex-positive education for all, and uplifting marginalized communities. Their daytime job is a program coordinator at Jasmine, an LGBTQI youth center in Jacksonville, Florida. Also in their free time, they serve as the board of directors for a GSA network. They also birthed a new type of inclusive dance party that centers queer and trans people of color called Duval Folks. Help me in welcoming Graciela.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you.
Of course, thanks for having. Thank you all so much for being here, and I'm so excited to have this needed conversation about the non-binary experience. So first and foremost, I kind of want to just start off with, What was your experience like? So let's start with Pren. What was your experience in finding your identity, exploring that, and feeling comfortable in it?
So when I was 13, I came out to a few people as bisexual, and around the age of 15, unfortunately, my dad went through my stuff, and after he realized that I was queer, which is how I now identify my sexual orientation, he started taking me to conversion therapy on the weekends without telling my mom. And that was obviously a really traumatic experience that had a really big impact on my life, my mental health, and also my faith. And then when I was about 17 is when I found information online about non-binary identities, and I started going through the process of coming out to myself, which is the first part of coming out. It's a very long process, sometimes never ending. And so I didn't really come out to other people until my first semester at USF in 2013. And I feel really fortunate to have attended USF because it seems like there's a really large population of trans and non-binary people on that campus, which is a really beautiful thing. And it gave me a really wonderful sense of community and also motivation to change things on campus for that community, to improve our lives and our experiences there. And I felt really supported by a lot of my professors and by the staff in the Office of Multicultural Affairs, who all empowered me to stand up for the changes that I saw necessary. And I feel really lucky for that experience because I know that there's so many people who don't have that sense of community and support. And so often our community tries to police how we express ourselves or how we act, especially in order to feel like we are trans enough or non-binary enough. And many people, when they think of non-binary, they have this image of an androgynous individual, usually white and skinny and assigned female at birth. And that is not the case for most non-binary people. It's just not. And that's something that I've learned throughout the years with facilitating outside the binary peer support group is that most non-binary people, you wouldn't be able to see them on the street and be like, oh, that's a non-binary person. Because this is an experience that we have inside, and we all express ourselves uniquely and however it feels most comfortable to us. And because of those stereotypes, for a really long time, I pushed away all feminine aspects of my identity and my expression because the message that I was receiving from the people around me and from the media was that if I enjoy any ounce of femininity, then I'm not trans enough or non-binary enough. And that's just not true. Non-binary can be femme, non-binary can be bearded, like our beautiful Christopher, who I wish I could grow a beard like that. And non-binary can look like anyone that you're walking past on the street. And that's why it's really important that we don't assume somebody's pronouns or gender just based off of how they're expressing that themselves in that day. And I know I kind of went off on a tangent, but that's me.
No, that was great. Thank you for sharing that. And one thing, that stood out is the fact that you found community in a safe space in USF. And that was amazing that you're able to go to a huge entity like that and be able to find community and feel like I'm finding myself and I'm finding my tribe. So that's amazing that you were able to find that. And I'm glad that you could put that out there because people who are watching may go there and feel the same way and not realize that there's a tribe there, waiting to accept them. So thank you so much for sharing that, Pren.
Thank you.
Christopher, what about you? What was your experience?
Wow. So coming into my identity, I think was very much informed by a blend of popular culture and other trans and non-binary folks that I had been so fortunate and privileged to either work alongside or just admire from the sidelines as I sort of serve as a cheerleader for the incredible things that they're doing in Florida and across the country. In Latin American culture in sort of Latinx spaces, we are a community that often uplifts a lot of hypermasculinity in order to give space to the patriarchy in a really sometimes very toxic way. But I do remember as a kid and even now, just like admiring a lot of queer presenting folks, or even just like queer folks in general who are just very out and open and are a part of our culture, specifically in popular culture, right? Like folks who have historically just like bended gender presentation and sexuality, like artists like Juan Gabriel, a very popular regional Mexican artist, or even some of our older audience may know, like Walter Mercado, an astrologist, an astrologist to the stars, who's always presented who's always presented in just like this very flamboyant nature that has broken the bounds of like gender presentation. And so that helped to inform sort of my upbringing around what playing with gender can look like. And then outside of that, I was just really fortunate to learn from trans women, trans men, and gender diverse folks from across the country that are doing like really phenomenal work specifically on racial justice and immigration across the country, whose work is often invisibilized in the broader narrative around what immigration and like immigrant justice looks like. And for me to be able to like admire that work and then get to meet some of these folks and then sit across the table from them over coffee or dinner or in a big union hall and just listen to them drop sermons on how we can break outside of what these very rigid structures of what gender is in our communities, and how like freedom is found in the nature of expression, right? Like whether it's picking up a makeup brush or letting your beard grow out, like that is a sign of just like freedom. And I remember getting chills and seeing and thinking like, I'm so resonating with this. And for a really long time, I identified as cis. And it was because of these folks like leaning in and in their own way offering mentorship, extending out a hand, and just like listening to this very awkward Latinx person like express all of this joy over like them existing freely, and exuding joy that I was able to really start to discover that there are parallels in our identities, and a big part of that was that the way that I wanted to express my gender and the way that I see myself and my gender is embodied in this infinite possibilities that are just out there, right? Like the body of trans people is cosmic, and I was like, I want to be a part of those cosmos. so that was really what that process of discovery was like.
That's incredible how we say it all the time, living your authentic self and living in your truth is so powerful, but how you've literally found freedom in it and found the beauty of it and the fluidity of it. And it doesn't fall into this little box. And I think that's the biggest thing that I wish people understood is when we're born into society, we're told to think this certain way, about everything. It doesn't matter if it's food, music, anything. You're told about these certain things. And it's amazing when you can kind of crack those boxes open and let it flow and just see where you fall into that. So that was absolutely beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Christopher.
Of course.
How was your experience, Graciela?
Wow. Well, first of all, I just have to recognize what both of these folks just said before me. So much of what both of you said, hardcore, just like resonated with me. I think for me, my journey definitely was not or has not been linear. So I come from Black and Latinx descent. And so already living in the South, I kind of, just felt so many feelings, so many emotions, just like being in those coming from those spaces and coming from that type of household, and in mostly like white spaces while living in the South. And so navigating that has always been like a process aside from just like my gender. And I think what helped a lot too was just being able to be around like other queers, finding my girls rock community, where I have friends literally all over the world, and just being able to get that education, to have that language of me feeling so many different things and not sure what they were, because I didn't see Black and Latinx folks around me. If I was around like Black community, I was feeling just kind of like ostracized, and then not knowing Spanish and being in Latinx communities, just feeling just like ostracized, and kind of like what Christopher was saying, like just these huge amounts of just like toxicness, even within like Black Latinx like situations. And so finding just community within Girls Rock definitely has helped just give me just a language to be able to be like, okay, I identify as this, or these are the things I was feeling as a child and didn't know like how to say it or what it was. And then realizing that there's people all over the world that have felt the same things that I have felt. So it was just validating to have that. And now I think where I kind of find like struggles is just kind of like finding community outside of just a social justice space. Because I feel like, you know, I find so many like queer Latinx folks like here in the city, but it's like the only time we have to meet is when we're fighting oppression or when we're trying to like rally up against something. And it's hard because there's just such a huge difference between a queer space and a gay space. And, you know, there's not a lot of that here, especially in the South, for cutie pox. And so I think what is also, you know, tough about that is that those people are so magical and are so fierce, but it's just, I wish we just had more spaces for us to be in. That's just not us trying to work against something or fight against something, just like having fun, you know? And it's not in a bar space, in a sober space. And so I think that's what kind of helped me carve out and create Duval Folks, is because it's just hard to just find community outside of a social justice landscape. And so that's just kind of like where my story was and how it began.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. And I can really resonate with the part of being multiracial. I'm Black, Puerto Rican, and Italian. And I don't know kind of where I fall. You know what I mean? With my Spanish family, I don't speak Spanish. So they're looking at me like, really?
Yeah.
So being in that, and then imagining being someone who's non-binary, who you're like, okay, you know, I'm explaining this to you, you're not understanding, whatever the case may be. I can imagine it being very, very difficult. And especially, like you said, safe spaces out of social justice spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Most communities can go find a space anywhere. But when you think of LGBTQ, especially queer safe spaces that aren't necessarily created by someone who is queer, it could just be, you know, an ally or something like that. They're very, very hard to come by. So thank you, you know, for the work that you do in creating that space for people.
Thank you.
I want to kind of change gears a bit, and just for our viewers who are kind of watching, but first and foremost, Prin, I know you wanted to say something.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate what both of you said, and I can really relate to that weird gray area of being multiracial and also of feeling ostracized from your Latinx family for being non-binary, because there is such strict like machismo culture, and you know, everything has to be super masculine, super feminine, and everything in the language is gendered. And I really relate to that experience, and I hope we can talk more about that too.
Absolutely. No, we definitely have to speak about that, because in so many communities, it's just difficult. But I want to ask, and this question's to anybody, anyone can kind of jump in, but can you explain some of the identities out of the binary, out of the normal gender binary that we hear about, just for people who are viewing who may not be too familiar?
So if it's okay, I'd like to start us off. Like was mentioned before, I studied women's and gender studies, so I kind of studied this. So I wanted to give a little bit of like that background to the topic too. So in the US, our society tells us that there are two genders, and that those genders should act a certain way, prefer certain colors, clothing, and even jobs. And for some people, this assigned gender and the things that come with it works for them. It's not an issue. But for many people, it doesn't work for them. And there are so many cisgender people that don't conform to the societal expectations of their gender. And we've mostly gotten to a place and time where this isn't usually an issue, at least for people assigned female at birth. More so it is an issue for people assigned male at birth, if they want to wear a skirt or makeup or crop top, despite their sexual orientation or gender identity, they might have desires to do any of those things. And an important thing to note is that in our society, in the United States, this is not true for every society or culture around the world or throughout history. Many cultures in history and even today recognize more than two genders. And even those that do recognize only two genders have different expectations and societal standards for those genders, different than what we have here in the US. And I think that's just important to give context when we are talking about non-binary identities, to make sure that everyone isn't under this assumption that the man-woman binary structure that we have in the US it's not natural, it's something that is societally constructed in order to meet the needs of our society. And I have so much more to say about this, but I want to let some other people speak. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for, putting context to that. Does anyone else have anything to add?
Yeah, so I thank you so much for setting that up. And talking about really the breaking of gender expectations, and also linking sort of the expansion of gender identity with culture. I also want to note that really the advent of sort of the binary that exists is a marker of white supremacy. It's a tool of colonization. The land that we embody right now is land that is not ours. It's land that belongs to First Nation peoples. I know that, like, coming from a family in northern Mexico, our land was taken from us. And so, and in our culture and in our indigenous community, we recognize more than one set of gender systems that exist, right? Like, just like we, recognize multiple racial categories, we also recognize multiple categories of gender, and that continues to prevail amongst indigenous communities across the world. And so, for us to recognize that when we are reinforcing the idea of a two-gender system of male and female, we are actually promoting a tool of white supremacy by erasing folks who historically broken down that system. And so, yeah, so I just wanted to name that as well, so that can help steer the direction of our conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Christopher. It's so true. And same thing to Pren, when we look at gender and how America makes it. In other cultures, there's multiple, and it's not even a thing. It's, it's just kind of human nature to them. So I think, yes, as America was created and all these ideology was created, it kind of fell into that. Graciela, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Christopher, for calling that and naming that, because that's definitely kind of where I was pivoting towards. And especially, I just want to recognize also that is so huge to Florida as well, as to what was happening, with the slave trade and things like that, and the horrible things that have happened in Florida. It just uplifts that and continues to do that. And you can see that throughout, the way that laws are written and why things aren't being passed in the ways that they're supposed to, because of the way that our society was set up. So yeah, I just wanted to recognize that as well.
No, absolutely. And, with that comes stigma. There's stigma with everything, but especially in LGBTQ individuals, and especially someone who's non-binary. So this is to anyone. Can we kind of talk about the stigma, discrimination you've maybe experienced and how you kind of navigated through that?
Was that towards, oh, I didn't know if that was that towards?
Yeah, towards anyone. Anyone can grab the question.
Yeah, I'll definitely say, I know for me, you know, when I first came out, I came out as pansexual, and then lesbian, and then now like moving into like a non-binary identity. It was a little tough at first, because again, like here, I feel in Florida, it's hard because, we're so used to being in gay spaces, and everywhere else in the world, there's like queer spaces. And so they kind of just like get it. And here it's just very hard because you're either gay or you're lesbian, or, and that's it. I feel sometimes as like gay community, queer community also uplift those binaries that we're talking about. Like if you're going to be gay, like this is what gay looks like. If you're going to be lesbian, you're either a butch or you're a femme. And so it's, we're still like using those binaries within like queer community. And I think that's just seen throughout sometimes, like being in Florida, what that looks like. And so it can be tough sometimes. It can be frustrating. And, even just like having to explain, like, no, my pronouns are they, them, not her pronouns are they, them. No, like, did you hear what I just said? And having to just like re-explain and also just like re-come out when there's just so much knowledge and dissertations and Tumblr threads on what it is to be non-binary and what that looks like. And then also too, just pivoting back to what Prin was saying, about sometimes when I do, present in a more femme way, folks not understanding what that is, it's like, what? So do you identify as she, her now? What's going on, and not understanding that, non-binary is fluid. It's so many things that you all have already talked about. But I think it's because we're not having, those types of conversations too. We're existing out here, but, we're not being invited to the table to be able to talk about how we feel and like what we've been going through, even though trans and non-binary folks are on the front lines of queer history, and have always been. And so, I think that's just something that's just been super frustrating for me, is just like folks just not being invited to the table to be able to tell their stories.
Absolutely. It's so important to, what we kind of realized after the Pulse tragedy was huge gaps in all different types of communities. But obviously what we realized was there were certain individuals who weren't being represented at these tables. And when you kind of go through it and you're like, okay, there is a gay male who is sitting here telling and giving out resources and saying, this is what the trans community needs, this is what the non-binary community needs, it kind of defeats the purpose when you can call somebody who is in that identity, who can advocate for their community. And I think it's so important to have spaces like that to tell your story. Telling your story is so important because when we look at it, it's like LGB, we're super progressive. Then you get to the T, it's like 20 years behind. Then you get to the queer and it's like 20 years behind that, and it's just eventually the goal is to really hopefully move the whole movement forward. And we can do that by having these conversations. Does anyone else want to kind of talk about anything regarding stigma, discrimination?
So the frustration of living in a place where we constantly have to re-educate folks, or like give folks an inkling about who we are and our identities, is a major frustration, and one that causes a lot of harm. Right? Like it's not. I mean, think of it as a million paper cuts. Right? Like these wounds don't close because time has passed. Those are still present. And so continually having to go to a doctor's appointment and seeing that our identity is not included in an intake form or having a conversation with peers, friends, and colleagues, and being misgendered in a space and not being, and that that issue not being addressed is frustrating, because it again makes you have to validate your existence as a person. It makes you have to explain not only about this identity in a theoretical perspective, but also like explain your humanity to another person, which is so frustrating because
And
at no
degrading.
point, and degrading, at no point does anyone else ever have to actually justify their existence. And as a non-binary person, I often find in spaces where I am not among family, I have to do that. And in certain cases, I'm willing to extend grace, especially for folks who are like in the process of coming along that journey of understanding, or who are doing it from a place of like true curiosity for the purpose of growth. And that's very easy to weed out. And yet other times it just becomes this mountain that we have to carry on our shoulders. And I don't know about you, but I get tired of carrying that mountain.
100%. It's, I think what's interesting about it is I always say that trans and non-binary individuals, we're the educators. We have no choice but to explain 80% of the time we're in a space, who we are, what that means, and what that's like. And I don't know if heterosexual cisgender individuals understand what that's like to go into a space. I know like in Gina's presentation all the time, she'll ask, do you remember the date and time that you picked your gender? And nobody can answer the question because nobody ever picks their gender. You know what I mean? And that point was so amazingly said about how it's just a million paper cuts over and over and over. And eventually you get used to it. But at some point you're thinking, when can I just be me? Like, when am I going to not have to explain myself every single time I'm in a room? So no, thank you so much for that point. And we touched a little bit on this, but I wanted to talk about storytelling. And all three of you are so open about telling your story. How did you find that courage? Because I'm sure there are people watching who identify as non-binary and they're like, I want to be open about it, but how did you do it? How did you come to the conclusion that you're like, listen, I'm going to live out loud and I hope my story helps somebody?
I can say for me, I just kind of have always been an open book. That's just, ever since elementary school, you can see all my progress reports. Graciela is great, but they talk a lot. That's just kind of always been who I am. But, working with young people, I kind of let them know, it's not always your labor to tell your story. Sometimes it's very painful. Sometimes it's very complicated. And like, again, Christopher was saying, I have to pivot back to this. There's a lot of, settler colonialism thinking, living in Florida. And sometimes it's just not safe, TBH. And so, we don't always have to do that. But I know for my cultures, like storytelling is just how we communicate. It's just what we do, sharing that space with people, hearing them, loving on them. I come from a huge Mexican family. And so storytelling, ghost stories, like it's just part of, my life growing up. But it's not always like, I feel for young people and for, non-binary trans folks to be able to tell their stories. Like there's plenty of information out there if someone needs to get it. Like it's very accessible. And so I think a lot of folks, lean on that if you don't feel like, if you're tired, we all tired out here, tell people to do that. But for me, it's just, I feel like it's my duty to do that, living out loud and just like, for folks to just know that I exist, I feel like is, just my duty to do. So that's just for me.
Absolutely. So anyone want to add to that?
Yeah, I can really relate to that because I just found that I was never really able to not be authentic to myself, and like hold back my queerness. It just always was bursting out of me. And I remember being a teenager and probably like 13 or 14 and just deciding like, okay, it is my personal mission to make people understand that queer people are not bad people, that we are loving people. And yeah, I just always kind of like carried that mindset with me. And for me, it's been really difficult and sometimes impossible for me to come out to my own family and explain those things to them. But I feel this really strong desire to educate other people so that other non-binary and trans people don't have to do that labor of educating their own families, because I know how hard it is. And for me, it's a lot easier to educate someone else's family than to educate my own. There's, I think, less emotional investment in some ways too. That makes it easier. So yeah.
No, and while we're on you, Pren, I wanted to ask kind of what inspired you, and can you talk a little bit about the work in Outside the Binary?
Yeah, so I had kind of taken over a trans support group at the time that was meeting monthly. And even when I was participating in the group, there were so many times when I just really couldn't relate to the others' experiences of really desiring to fit into this mold of gender, I guess. A lot of binary trans people have those desires, which is totally understandable. And for me, I just couldn't relate. And I went to an LGBT leadership camp when I was in college, called Camp Pride. And we had breakout groups, and I had the same experience in this breakout group, and I requested the leadership of the camp if we could have a solely non-binary focused group, because I really wanted to see what it felt like to be in community and really relate to the people that I was sharing support with. And after that experience, when I came back, I really wanted to bring that sort of setting to my community locally here in Tampa. So that's pretty much what inspired me to start Outside the Binary. And, obviously we were only meeting once a month at first, and now we're meeting 4 times a month, and it's amazing. Can't really do social events now under quarantine, but I'm sure we will one day have social events soon too.
No, well, thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you for the work that you do, creating a space for non-binary individuals to feel a sense of community, feel a sense of support. Thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you so much. It's really rewarding, honestly, and helps me heal so much too.
We need it sometimes. And I think, as leaders, we forget about ourselves sometimes. We're so used to taking care of the community that we'll forget that we need to feel supported. We want sometimes to just lean on somebody and cry. So, spaces like that, that's exactly what that's for. Christopher, what inspired you to create Q Latinx?
So I have to say that Q Latinx was created by a community of people who were responding to the Pulse nightclub shooting here in Central Florida. Queer and trans Latinx folks who felt a deep connection to the space, folks who lost friends and loved ones, folks who survived the shooting, and folks who had felt the deep impacts of this harmful attack in our community, who were crying out for space to be themselves, crying out for community, crying out for sanctuary. For generations, for centuries, queer and trans folks have found safety in our bodies through movement. And when the Pulse nightclub was taken as a result of this horrific act of violence, that space of sanctuary was gone. And folks were trying to find some place to be able to process. And unfortunately, at the time in our community, there just were not a plethora of services that culturally or linguistically had the appropriate needs in order to cater to Latinx communities, immigrant communities, communities that didn't speak English as a primary language or a secondary language. And so we started out as a support group, strangers meeting in people's homes, gathering together around food, around music, through word of mouth. And over time, in these healing circles, we recognized that there were some underlying challenges in our community. And then from that, this organization was really birthed by so many folks who said, we are invisibilized. We've never seen ourselves in leadership. We've never been invited to the table. And rather than sit and continue to be frustrated and sit in this sadness, we're going to demand a space. And so be ready, because we're bringing our chairs to that table. And over time, that happened. And so the organization has, grown because of that, because of folks who just said, enough is enough. I have a voice, and I demand that my voice be heard.
And thank you for so much for the work that you do, and all of you with Q Latinx, because the advocacy that you all do, the light that you shine on the community, the education that you all do is so, so important. It educates so many people. And thank you so much. Graciela, I know you talked a little bit about it, but can you go a little bit more in detail about Duval Folks and how, kind of what inspired you to do that, and kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so for me, kind of what inspired me to want to create Duval Folks was I was DJing a lot around the city, and I just was not comfortable, honestly, just DJing, being touched, being bothered by just belligerent, just like drunk folks, and just not feeling good in that space, just feeling micromanaged in that space, being just told like what I could play, what I couldn't play. And it just wasn't fun, honestly. It was not fun at all. And for me, I wanted to create a space that also was for queer, POC, like Latinx, Black people in my community, that wasn't labeled or segregated under an urban night, because that just also didn't feel good at all for me. Because, hip hop, Latinx culture is ingrained in this community, in music. You look at the top charts in the USA, they're mostly hip hop or reggaeton. And so it's not fair that we are segregated to this like weird night. And then also wanting to make that space accessible, making it free, making it sliding scale, just like having a space where you can be free and you can also have ability to get there. There was also like ride sharing within Duval Folks as well. And I just wanted to have also a safe space that just wasn't in a club setting. And so that's basically what birthed it, was just me being unhappy. And like Christopher was saying, I was like, I need this space, not only for me, but also just for my community, because it just didn't exist in Jacksonville. And so the first night of Duval Folks, we packed out the bar, packed out that space. It was just wall to wall people. And I was just so shook, first of all, that all those people came. And it just made me realize that, wow, this community has been thirsty for this. And, it just needed to happen. And, after that, there were so many like trans and non-binary folks that were just like, wow, gee, like, I didn't know this is what I needed, but this is what I needed. And I've had a full year of it. And, people have made friends through it. I also use Duval Folks to highlight Black and Latinx-led communities in my city, donate to them, and just continue to share space with like other folks in my community. It's just been very healing for me as well, because I just didn't feel comfortable in the gay clubs at all. It just didn't feel right. It just didn't feel good. That's all I could say. It just did not feel good. And so being able to like carve out this space has just been so like healing for me. I think I cry at every single one because it's like my people are there with me. And I can just see just so much happiness, and like you can just feel it when you walk into the room. And people know, you ask people pronouns, you don't touch nobody. I get daddy on them. I'm like, listen, this is not how to do up in here. And people respect it. And it's awesome to see that in a dance space. And, just marginalized people's bodies moving is just power to me. And I'm so inspired by it, and just by this beautiful community when they do happen. And I don't know when it's going to happen, but it's going to be in a virtual space because I miss my babies.
No, and thank you for the work. And the beautiful thread of commonality between everyone here is there wasn't a space, so we created it. And that's the beauty of our community, is that if we don't find something or we don't have something, we're going to create it for ourselves. And that I just absolutely love that. For people who are watching that may think that they're non-binary or struggling with their identity, what's some advice that you would give them? And that can be anybody can take that.
Oh, dang, we all waiting for each other. Then we all know.
Uh-oh, everyone's on mute.
I'll go. I feel like I'm talking a lot. I'll let somebody else go.
No, go ahead, please.
I had some advice. I would just say, I know for me, when I kind of was in a space where I didn't know, I was like, I came out as this. Can I come out again? Like, how many times can I come out? Is there a number to this? You know, for me, just finding like folks on Instagram and like reading their stories and, you know, just like sitting with yourself, I think too. A really big part of my journey, which I meant to mention earlier, was therapy. Talking to my therapist, my first therapist at the Women's Center, she helped me so much in just like affirming me and just like letting me know that like it's okay that, you know, you question this, that you're you don't know sometimes, you know, and that's okay too, because like we've been saying, like gender is a social construct. Gender is not real at all. You know, it can look like so many different things, and it truly was created. It's not real, and so it's a journey, you know. And I feel like for me, I navigate so many different things within gender. I mean, most of my life is around, you know, queerness. Like I work at a queer space, you know, I have so many queer friends, and you know, my timeline is just gay and queer. And so sometimes I even forget that, you know, there is a straight life. Like there's people out there. And also not saying that trans folks aren't hetero, but you know, hetero like things. Like I even forget that that's real sometimes, because I'm just so submerged in it. And just know that there is community out there. It's not that far anymore. It's here, and you know, it's just, it can be a journey, and that's okay. That's all I'm gonna say. Sorry, long-winded answer.
No, thank you for that. Christopher, any advice for someone who may be struggling with their identity?
Absolutely. I feel like someone who is beginning to question their gender is someone who is like tapping into, I don't know, the spirit of our ancestors, who really have just like held space for us, like in your blood as a queer and as a trans person, like lives like divinity, right? Like they have molded us, they have shaped us, they have inspired us, and so they have given us the permission to be able to play with our hair and play with our makeup and play with our clothes and play with pronouns and just like play with expression and play with all of these different like toys that just exist in reality, so that we can walk out into the world and be like just our beautiful, divine, powerful selves. Right? So just honor that, like know you come from a lineage of like folks who have always pushed against what is deemed acceptable, so that we could exist in like the light that we have now.
Absolutely. It's true to just, you know, embrace who you are. Don't feel like you have to fit into this. Don't feel like that just because people are telling you that I don't understand it, it's not normal. People didn't understand everything at one point. We all had to learn. So I think it's just beautiful to find yourself and find that identity and really live in it. Prin, any advice?
Yeah, I really appreciate what everyone has said so far. So something that I noticed a lot through the outside the binary groups is that imposter syndrome is so normal. Feeling like you are not trans enough or not non-binary enough is so normal, and it's a big part of being non-binary and trans. And you know, when you're constantly being told by society and the people around you that trans people don't exist, or you know, all the negative messages that we get about trans people, we internalize that transphobia, and it manifests as many things, including imposter syndrome. And so what I always tell people is that if you are questioning whether you are trans enough, then you are trans enough, because cisgender people are not questioning themselves that. And there is no right way to be trans or non-binary. It is completely unique to your own experience. And something that Christopher kind of mentioned earlier too, that I want to like uplift is, for me too, I see non-binary as equivalent to freedom of choice to express yourself however feels right. And I really believe that everyone deserves to experience gender euphoria and gender congruence, which is a word I recently learned from my friend Ari, who I think is watching. So shout out to Ari. And gender congruence, and just feeling like congruent in your own identity, regardless of what the people around you, what messages you're getting from the people around you.
Thank you for sharing that beautiful advice, everyone. I mean, it's true. Just be who you are and find your community, find your support. Don't hang around people who are telling you you're not trans enough, you're not this or you're not that. Hang around the people who don't question your identity, don't care how you identify, but just care about your heart. The last thing that I kind of want to discuss with everybody is, for businesses, say that there's a business owner that's watching that wants to help make their business a bit more inclusive for non-binary identities. What would be your advice on that? Whether it's policies and procedures, way that you handle bathrooms, things like that. Is there any advice that you could give someone who wants to make their business more inclusive?
Go ahead, Graciela. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. I was just gonna say, one of the things that you can do is just start with language. Just like starting taking gender out of how your staff like speaks to people, you know, when there's groups of people or when there's a single person, like, you know, hey friend, or y'all, or how are you, you know, maybe asking the person what their pronouns are, you know, simple things. Also with restrooms, you know, if there's single stall restrooms, like go ahead, just throw that all gender sign up on there. I think that, you know, those are very simple things that you can do. Also having your coworkers wear pronoun pins, you know, just so, you know, when folks come in, they can know that, okay, like, you know, and then just having those conversations as well. You know, it's not, you know, you don't have to, you know, police yourself. Like it's not as hard as a lot of people think, because we do use, you know, different pronouns all the time. Like they is, you know, can be used as a singular pronoun, and just like have those conversations with the people and give each other grace, like Christopher was saying, correcting each other in the moment. I think that can help as well. Those are just, you know, a couple, I think, quick things you can just start implementing.
Absolutely. Christopher?
Yeah, I think in addition to what was already shared, I think on the back end, looking at your HR policies and making sure that the language that you're using in there is not gender specific, but rather gender inclusive. Recognizing that things like maternity and paternity leave is also like a thing that is reinforcing the binary. And so just like labeling that something different, like caregiver leave. Inviting your staff to like feel comfortable with talking about their gender identity. Some folks may be playing with different names to see, you know, they may be trying a different name on this week than they did last week, and that's totally okay. So like I encourage you to have, and if you have staff schedules, like I encourage you to be flexible in changing the name that's on the schedule to accommodate those folks, that they feel like they can go to work in a supportive environment. Again, I love the suggestion of pronouns on the name tag. That's great. Changing language when working with your client base is important. Single stall restrooms or all gender inclusive restrooms are super important. You know, all of these things are just really, you know, simple, little minute changes. I love that someone noted the Pro Equality Business Guide in the chat. That's a really wonderful resource. Equality Florida has an entire team of folks who can help to really create inclusive workspaces, as any group that's listed in this that's on this video call can as well. So, you know, reach out to your local LGBTQ groups if you have questions about how to create more inclusive workplaces.
And Prin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, that was a lot. They covered a lot of things, and I think that is like the bare minimum of what everyone needs to do to really, you know, make job opportunities an equal playing field for trans and non-binary people. Let's see. I think that sharing your pronouns when you're sharing your name should be a normalized practice, especially in those settings. That does two things. On one hand, it makes trans and non-binary people feel more comfortable sharing their own pronouns and being themselves. It tells them, like, we understand that we can't assume your pronouns by looking at you, and that really sends a big message. And then it also normalizes the sharing of pronouns in spaces that are dominated by cisgender people, and opens up that conversation to explain, okay, why is this something that is important? Even if there are no trans people currently working at that job, if you start doing that, then when a trans person or a non-binary person starts working there, they're going to feel so much more comfortable. And in addition to that, I think educating all of the staff on LGBT identities and how to respect trans and non-binary people, I think that's vital because, you know, obviously most people don't have that understanding. So if we are able to provide that in the workplace, then that will get us really far ahead.
Absolutely. And last thing I want to ask really quickly, what is one thing that you want people to know about non-binary individuals? Just one last thing, because I know this was a lot of information, but if you could like wrap it up in a little bow, what would you say?
So I would probably say that we are just humans trying to find some peace and happiness in this chaotic world and chaotic life so that we can get to a place where we're thriving and not just surviving. So just let us live, let people live, and express themselves however feels right to them. That's what I would say.
So thank you, Prin. Christopher?
We're here. We're not going anywhere.
Yes.
That's it.
Love it.
That's it. I would definitely say too, just being open and just like listening to people telling their stories and, you know, not uplifting toxic and white supremacy. Just listen. That's it.
It's true. At the end of the day, we're all just human. We all just want to live our authentic life and we all just want to be happy. I want to thank you all so, so much for joining us today. Prin, Christopher, Graciela, thank you for sharing your stories, being open and vulnerable. And thank you to all of the viewers who came on to join us for TransChat. This was incredible, so insightful for me. And I know for the viewers, the live comments have been going crazy. So once again, thank you all so, so much. Please be safe and have a wonderful evening.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.